My name is Margaret Lewis, but everyone in town calls me Maggie. I'm 60 years old, a retired medical technician, and I live alone on the edge of Helena, Montana, where the wind never seems to stop and the silence can feel heavier than snow. That Sunday morning started like any other. The sun was pale, the air smelled of hay and frost, and I was refilling the water tank behind the barn. My hands were cracked from years of work, but I still liked the feeling of being useful. That's when my phone buzzed in the pocket of my flannel jacket. I wiped my hands on my jeans and checked the screen, expecting a message from my son, Evan. It was from him, but not the kind of message any mother wants to read. "Mom, we need some space. Please stop coming over, and it's getting uncomfortable." I stared at the words, thinking maybe I'd misread them. I blinked once, twice, but they didn't change. The metal pipe hissed beside me, water spilling onto the ground. I didn't move to stop it. "Uncomfortable," I whispered, the word rolling in my mouth like something bitter. For 30 years, I had worked double shifts, missed holidays, and sold my own house to help Evan buy the auto shop he'd dreamed of. I had built my life around his comfort. Now I was too much for it. The wind lifted a handful of dry leaves and scattered them across my boots. My phone slipped from my fingers, landing face down in the mud. Somewhere inside the barn, the horses shifted, restless, as if they could feel what I couldn't yet say aloud. Something had broken. I knelt, picked up the phone, wiped it clean, and saw my reflection in the dark glass, lined, tired, small. For the first time in my life, I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. That text didn't just end a morning. It ended the illusion that I still had a family. When the text from Evan came that morning, it didn't come out of nowhere. Not really. Looking back, the distance had been building like slow rust on metal, the kind that spreads quietly until one day the whole frame gives way. After my husband died, the house felt too big, too silent. So I poured myself into Evan's dream. He'd always loved engines, took apart lawnmowers at 12, rebuilt a dirt bike by 16. When he told me he wanted his own garage, I sold the house where his father and I had lived for 32 years and moved into a small place near the foothills. The profit from that sale became the down payment for Lewis Auto Repair. I remember the smell of motor oil the first day we opened, the bright red sign glinting in the sun, the pride on his face. It felt like we were both starting over. At first, Evan called me every night about invoices, suppliers, even what color to paint the waiting room. I liked being needed. I'd stop by the shop before my shift at the clinic, bringing coffee and sandwiches, the kind he liked with too much mustard. I didn't notice when he stopped asking for advice and started sighing when I offered it. Then came Samantha, smart, confident, quick to smile. I welcomed her with open arms, maybe too open. After the wedding, they invited me to Sunday dinners, but over time the invitations slowed. Once, when I dropped off homemade soup, Samantha met me at the door, apron still on, and said softly, "You don't have to worry so much. Maggie, we've got things handled." Her tone was kind, but her eyes were tired. I told myself she just needed space. Months later, Evan mentioned they were repainting the shop. I offered to help, but he said they'd hired someone. When I drove by, the new sign read, "Lewis and Brooks Auto, family owned." My maiden name, Lewis, was still there, but Brooks was Samantha's. I stood across the street, the autumn air sharp in my throat, watching workers carry away the old sign. For a moment, I felt like they were hauling off a part of me. That night, I sat at my small kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. My hands smelled faintly of grease, even though I hadn't touched an engine in months. I wondered when helping had turned into hovering. I wondered when my love had started to look like a burden. Evan called less and less. When I left messages, he answered with one-word texts: busy, later, fine. I told myself he was working hard, building his life the way I'd raised him to, but deep down, something cold settled in my chest, the sense that I'd built him a home he no longer wanted me to enter. The week before that Sunday morning, I stopped by the shop without calling first. I just wanted to drop off a box of his father's old tools, things Evan used to borrow. Through the office window, I saw them laughing, Evan, Samantha, and a young mechanic wiping his hands on a rag. The sound of their laughter drifted out when the door opened. It was the sound of a life moving on. I left the box by the door and drove away before anyone noticed. Now, standing in the yard with mud on my boots and my phone in my hand, I realized the message hadn't been sudden at all. It was just the final click of a door that had been closing for years. The hose still hissed behind me, spilling water into the dirt until it turned to dark, heavy clay. I shut it off, the metal handle cold in my palm. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, twice, and then the world went quiet again. I told myself it was just space. But inside, I already knew. Something much larger had been taken from me. That night, the house felt colder than usual. The radiator clicked and groaned, fighting the October chill, but it couldn't touch the frost creeping up from inside me. I sat at the kitchen table with the old box of receipts from the garage, the ones Evan used to leave for me to organize when things were just starting out. My fingers traced the handwriting on the envelopes, his slanted, rushed script that had always reminded me of his father. I pulled out one folder marked Ownership and Taxes. Inside, neatly tucked between invoices, was the partnership contract from 6 years ago. I had signed as co-owner, 70-30, because Evan was young then, just starting, and the bank wouldn't give him a loan on his own. He'd promised to change the paperwork later, once the business took off, but later had never come. My breath caught when I saw my name printed across the top, Margaret Lewis, co-owner. My heart thudded once, hard. It wasn't anger that rose inside me, but a strange, calm clarity. I wasn't powerless. I had simply forgotten I had a say. The phone rang then, sharp against the quiet, for a heartbeat. I thought maybe it was Evan, ready to take back the words he'd sent. But when I answered, it was Grace, my old colleague from the clinic. She asked if I was coming to the retirees' brunch next week. I almost said yes, but then I looked around, the bare walls, the unpaid bills, the silence, and I told her I wasn't sure. My voice didn't sound like mine. After the call, I poured myself a cup of coffee that went cold before I could drink it. I sat there staring at the deed, the edges yellowed, and whispered to no one. It's still mine. The next morning, the sun was bright but unforgiving. I drove into town to see Henry Keller, a lawyer I'd known since my hospital days. He looked older, softer around the eyes, but still sharp as ever. When I told him about the partnership, he read through the papers quietly, then nodded. "You're still the legal co-owner, Maggie," he said. "You have every right to withdraw, sell, or transfer your share. They can't make changes without your consent." I felt the words settle in my chest like a steady heartbeat. "So, if I wanted out..." "You could walk away tomorrow," Henry replied gently. "Or sooner, if you'd like." I thanked him, though my throat was tight. When I stepped outside, the wind caught my scarf and lifted it like a flag. For the first time in months, the air didn't feel heavy. It felt sharp, alive. Driving home, I passed the shop, through the glass. I saw Evan helping a customer, head bent in concentration. He looked happy. I didn't feel anger, only the ache of distance, the kind that can't be crossed by roads. I didn't know what I'd do yet, but I knew what I wouldn't do anymore. I wouldn't beg to belong. That night, I opened my journal for the first time in years and wrote a single line. Tomorrow, I start taking my life back. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the blinds, thin and cold. I'd barely slept, but my mind felt sharper than it had in months. I made coffee, black and bitter, and sat at the table with the deed and partnership papers spread out like a map of my mistakes. Every number, every signature, every promise I'd believed in stared back at me by 9. I was back at Henry Keller's office with a decision that no longer scared me. Henry raised an eyebrow when he saw me walk in again so soon. "I thought you'd take some time to think about it," he said. "I did," I replied, setting the papers down. "All night." He glanced through the forms, then looked up. "You're sure you want to proceed?" "Yes. No drama, no confrontation, just closure." He nodded. "We can file the withdrawal this afternoon. You'll retain your share of the funds, and they'll be notified in writing. Quiet, clean, legal." "Quiet," I repeated, almost to myself. That word felt right. When I left the office, the wind had picked up. The world smelled of gasoline and winter. I drove to the shop one last time, parking across the street where no one would notice. Through the window, I saw Samantha behind the counter, talking to a customer. Evan was bent over an engine, his sleeves rolled, a smear of oil across his cheek. He looked grown, capable, whole, and completely separate from me. I took a breath that tasted like iron and rain. Then I wrote a note on the back of an old envelope from my glove compartment. "You said you needed space. Now you have all of it. Mom." I left the note under the wiper of his truck. Nothing more. No explanations. No goodbye. Then I drove to the bank, closed the business account tied to my name, and transferred the remaining balance to my own savings. When the teller asked if I wanted to leave a contact number for the other account holder, I smiled and said, "No, I don't think he'll need it." That evening, I packed the few things I still kept from the garage, the blue rag with grease stains, the framed photo of Evan as a boy holding a wrench too big for his hands, and a small tin of bolts he once called treasures. I placed them in a box and taped it shut. The house was silent except for the ticking clock. I stood there for a long moment, the box at my feet, and whispered, "You built a life. Evan, now I'll build mine." Outside, the wind howled through the bare trees, but I felt still, anchored. I didn't need to fight or explain. I had already taken back what was mine. 3 days passed before I heard anything. The silence was almost peaceful until it wasn't. That Wednesday evening, just as the sun was sinking behind the mountains, someone pounded on my door hard enough to rattle the frame. When I opened it, Evan stood there, face flushed, eyes wild. For a moment, he looked like the boy who used to run home after football practice, breathless and full of excuses. But this wasn't that boy. This was a man cornered by something he didn't understand. "Mom," he said, his voice tight. "What the hell did you do? The bank called. You pulled your name. Froze the account? You sold your half?" I didn't answer right away. I just stepped aside and gestured for him to come in. He didn't move. The anger in his face made him look older, harder. "It wasn't your half, Evan," I said quietly. "It was ours. And you forgot that." He let out a sharp laugh, one that sounded more like disbelief than humor. "We built that shop together. You can't just—" I did. I interrupted. My tone was calm, but my hands trembled slightly. "You asked for space. I gave you all of it." His jaw tightened. "This is insane. Do you know what you've done? The employees, the clients. Samantha's devastated. We had a life there. I looked him straight in the eye. So did I. Until you decided I didn't belong in it. For a second, the only sound between us was the ticking of the old wall clock. Then his shoulders slumped, and his voice softened. We didn't mean it like that. Sam just needed boundaries. She felt like you were still running things. Boundaries, I repeated, the word landing heavy. There's a difference between setting boundaries and building walls. He rubbed his face with both hands, exhausted. You could have talked to me. I tried, I said, quieter now. For years. He stood there, caught between guilt and pride, his breath coming unevenly. Finally, he shook his head. I don't even recognize you anymore. Maybe, I said, because you never really looked. He didn't answer. He just turned toward the door, pausing long enough to say, You've burned every bridge, Mom. When the door closed, the house sank back into silence. I waited for the tears to come, but they didn't. There was only stillness, heavy, complete, almost kind. I realized then that what I'd burned wasn't a bridge. It was the illusion that one still existed. A week after Evan left, I packed 2 suitcases and drove south until the mountains turned gentler and the sky opened wide. I didn't have a plan, just an address written on the back of a receipt. Silver Creek, a quiet lakeside town I'd visited once years ago, felt like the kind of place where nobody knew my name. And that was exactly what I needed. The first few days were strange. My hands kept reaching for things that weren't there, a wrench, my phone, the sound of my son's voice. I rented a small cabin that smelled of cedar and coffee, with windows that looked out on water so still it seemed to listen. Each morning, I woke before dawn, made coffee, and watched the mist roll off the lake. For the first time in decades, I didn't have to be anyone's mother, anyone's helper. I didn't owe my time to anyone. The quiet wasn't lonely, it was healing. On the 3rd morning, I wandered through town and saw a "For Lease" sign in the window of a small brick storefront. The space was narrow but bright, with wooden shelves that smelled of dust and sun. Something inside me stirred. 2 months later, after paperwork and painting and one too many late-night cups of instant coffee, the sign above the door read, "Second Chances Tea and Books." The locals came slowly at first, a retired teacher looking for decaf, a young mother who needed a place to sit while her toddler napped, a man who fixed fences and liked peppermint tea. I listened more than I spoke. Sometimes I caught myself smiling without realizing it. There were nights I still thought of Evan. I wondered if he was angry, or if the shop was still standing, if Samantha still arranged the front desk the way I used to, but instead of pain, I felt something different, a soft kind of acceptance, like the lake water smoothing out a stone. One afternoon, as I locked up the shop, a gust of wind carried the scent of oil and pine, faint but familiar. I looked up at the mountains and whispered, "You're doing fine, Evan." And for the first time, I truly meant it. Winter crept into Silver Creek quietly, dusting the town in white. The lake froze at the edges, and the morning smelled of wood smoke and frost. Business at Second Chances stayed steady. The regulars had begun calling me Miss Maggie, and I'd learned the exact moment when the teapot started to whistle. Life had settled into a calm rhythm, one I didn't think would ever be broken again, until the bell above the door chimed one afternoon, and I looked up. It was Evan. He stood in the doorway, snow on his jacket, hair longer than I remembered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt fragile, like thin glass. "I saw the shop on Facebook," he said finally, voice rough. "You really did it, huh?" I smiled faintly. I did. Tea and books, safer than engines. He stepped closer. eyes wandering over the shelves and the soft light spilling through the window. "You always talked about opening a place like this. I guess I just needed a reason," I said. He nodded, hands buried in his coat pockets. "Mom, His voice broke. "I'm sorry for how things ended. I was angry and stupid. Samantha, too. We both were." I didn't rush to fill the silence. The kettle whistled softly in the background. "I know," I said at last. "You were building your life. I just forgot that I was allowed to build mine, too." Evan swallowed hard, then gave a small, nervous laugh. "Dad would have liked this place." "He would have," I agreed, and for the first time in a long while, the mention of his father didn't ache. He hesitated at the door before leaving. "Would it be okay if I came by again, just for tea?" I smiled, gentle and real. "You don't need an invitation. Just bring your own mug next time." He grinned, quick, shy, like the boy I remembered, and then he was gone, leaving a swirl of cold air and something warmer behind. When the bell fell silent, I realized I was still smiling. The past hadn't returned, it had simply learned how to knock politely. That night, after Evan left, I stayed late in the shop. The world outside was quiet, the snow falling in slow, deliberate flakes. Inside, the soft hum of the heater filled the space, and the smell of chamomile tea lingered in the air. I sat by the window with my journal open, a pen resting between my fingers, but for the first time in months, I didn't know what to write. For so long, my words had been about loss, how it felt to be invisible, how love could bruise without leaving a mark. But that night, the words wouldn't come because I wasn't hurting anymore. I was simply still. I thought about Evan's face when he walked into the shop, the way his voice cracked on the word, sorry. There was truth in it, not a grand apology, not a perfect one, but enough to start something new. I realized that forgiveness didn't have to mean going back. Sometimes, it just meant unclenching your heart. I closed the journal and looked around the little store I'd built, shelves filled with stories, the faint echo of laughter from earlier customers, the teacups lined neatly by the sink. It wasn't the life I had once imagined, but it was mine. Every nail in the wall, every stain on the counter, every decision, I had chosen them all. For years, I had confused love with sacrifice, thinking the more I gave, the more I belonged. But love, I'd finally learned, wasn't measured in how much of yourself you lost. It was in how much of yourself you kept, even when it hurt. The clock above the counter ticked softly, marking the rhythm of a life rebuilt. I walked to the door, turned the sign to closed, and watched the reflection of the shop lights shimmer against the window. Outside, Silver Creek glowed under the snowfall, quiet and forgiving. Before leaving, I wrote one last note on a piece of parchment I used for customer quotes and pinned it beside the counter. Freedom isn't loud. Sometimes it sounds like peace. I switched off the lights, locked the door, and stepped into the cold. The air tasted clean, sharp, alive. My boots crunched against the snow as I walked toward the cabin, and for the first time in years, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking toward myself. The lake was frozen solid under the moonlight, smooth as glass. I stopped for a moment, looked up at the stars, and whispered, "Thank you." I didn't know exactly to whom, maybe to the silence, maybe to the pain that had taught me how to begin again. Either way, it answered in the only way it knew how, with quiet. And that quiet, I realized, was everything I had been searching for. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, please subscribe and join me for more every day.